blood. One door opened, then another. Daylight appeared. The third door was open, and he started on the last. Time was running out. Something went snap, and the broken tool dropped to the ground. He was placed in chains again, and his spirit fell to a low ebb. The conditions in his cell were impossible. He was continually wet to the skin with icy water that dripped on him from the vaulted roof. He fell sick and was incapacitated for months. No doctor came to see him. He was given no medicine. He was nearly skin and bones when his unconquerable fortitude began to revive. He made friends with a sentry named Gelfhart, and the man was kind enough to smuggle a small file into the cell. Trenck filed his way out of the chains and contrived a way to trick the guards when they made their daily inspection. He filled the fracture in each cut link with bread rubbed over the rusty iron. The camouflage was perfect. Now he had the freedom of his cell. The floor was wide oak planking held together by huge nails a foot long and half an inch thick. Trenck prized one of them out, sharpened the end with his file, and made a chisel. Then he cut one of the planks and went to work digging a tunnel under the wall of his cell. The fort was built on white sand, which made for easy digging, but the problem was what to do with the sand. He could always replace the plank and fill the cut with dirt-rubbed bread to pass inspection, but there was no way to conceal the sand. There was a small grilled aperture leading to the ditch, and though it was too small to admit a man, Gelfhart was able to pass some yards of cloth through it. Trenck cut them into long, narrow bags, filled them with earth and sand, filed an opening in the grill, and stuffed the bags out to Gelfhart, who scattered the contents in the ditch and passed the bags back. Trenck's hole was 4 feet deep and just wide enough for him to kneel and stoop in. He had to lie down to dig, then get up and stoop over like a dog to throw out the sand between his legs. And the narrow space in which all these evolutions had to be performed made the labor incredible. And after this back-breaking daily toil, everything had to be replaced and his chains put on again. To add to the difficulties, Gelfhart mounted guard only once a fortnight, and so the work progressed very slowly. Then winter came, and Trenck suffered greatly without heat. Moreover, the governor suspected that Trenck might possibly be contemplating another break for freedom, and he ordered that a monstrous iron collar be clapped around the baron's neck and fastened to his ankle chains. Trenck fell sick again. Racked with fever, trembling with cold, suffering fearful headaches, his swollen neck inflamed by the iron collar, Trenck nearly died. He laid in a comatose state for over 2 months before he began a long, painful recovery. His spirit revived with his body, but Gelfhart brought him bad news. The sentries had been doubled and the ditch was now under constant patrol. "You'll have to change the direction of your tunnel and dig toward the entrance of the gallery in the main rampart," he said. "How far is this gallery?" 37 feet. Trenck had now been in Magdeburg for nearly 3 years, and the news that he would have to dig 37 feet through dirt and sand and foundation stones with nothing but his bare hands and a makeshift chisel was vastly disheartening. But Trenck's motto was death or freedom. He started to dig. His greatest fear now was that the noise of his digging would be heard by the numerous sentries, so he relied more on his bare hands than on his chisel. His progress was appallingly slow, and the worst of it was that Gelfhart could only rarely find an opportunity to scatter the dirt and sand for him. Each day Trenck had to scoop up all the sand he'd emptied out of the tunnel, sack it, and store the bags back in the hole. This consumed a great deal of time and energy, as did the careful replacing of the floor planks and the resuming of his chains. The fatiguing labor of one night's work was so severe that he would be forced to rest the following 3 days. In this manner, it took him 6 months to go 10 feet. Then he encountered the foundation of the rampart. He could not remove the stones because he could not dispose of them, so he had to dig a U-shaped dip to pass under them. The sand was damp and there was water at this new level. The work dragged like a wounded turtle into months and on into years, until one day Trenck found himself only 3 feet from his objective. Then fate stepped in on him again.
Jeez.
A sentry put his ear to the ground and heard Trenck filling up his hole with the sandbags. He called the officer of the guard and they entered the cell only a few minutes after Trenck had replaced the last stone. The major in charge was a rather stupid fellow, and he found nothing. "Idiot," he said to the sentry. "It was a mole you heard, not Trenck. How could it possibly be he at work underground at such a distance from his dungeon?" Trenck was convinced that his time was now very short, and as soon as the soldiers left, he rushed to his tunnel to make his last effort at escape. But the sentry who had heard him before was still on duty, and once again heard Trenck burrowing. He called for the guard and the major, and all of them went into the gallery and listened. The first Trenck knew of it was when he looked back along the tunnel and saw a light. He was thunderstruck. The game was obviously up, and the guards were patiently awaiting for him to emerge from his hole. Discouraged, Trenck crawled back over the sand he had thrown behind him and went out to face them. The tunnel was filled up, the masonry replaced, and Trenck was chained in new fetters. The guards made only one mistake. They forgot to search his clothes. Trenck still had his file. He was so exhausted from his last undertaking that he was little better than a skeleton. Again he was attacked by a violent fever and succumbed to illness. 6 long months elapsed before he recovered enough strength to make a new bid for freedom. The obvious course was to mine through his old tunnel, but first he had to rid himself of some of the sand in the hole. He filed through his chains, opened the tunnel, and started pitching the sand onto the floor of his cell. That done, he closed the hole and began digging a second hole, this one under the door. He made as much noise as he could so that the sentries would be bound to hear him, and as he had expected, they came into his cell and found him hard at work. They hauled all his sand away in wheelbarrows, boarded up the new hole, and replaced his fetters. They thought he was crazy to dig out under the door where there was a triple guard to pass, and they were so busy laughing at his foolishness that none of them had the sense to notice that 3 times as much sand was removed as the false hole could possibly contain. Trenck returned to his daily labor. Remove the planks, remove the filled bags, dig, throw out the sand, scoop up every grain and put it in the bags, place the bags back in the hole, replace the planks, and climb into his chains, over and over and over again, day after month after year, always wet, hungry, and enfeebled by exhaustion, with intervals of violent sickness. 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet, then a day of horror. He was mining under the foundations of the rampart, and he was just about to wiggle backward with a sandbag when his foot dislodged a stone in the wall above. The stone dropped with a muffled thump and closed up the passage. Trenck found himself buried alive in a space smaller than a grave pit. He couldn't go ahead, couldn't go back, couldn't turn on either side. The horror of claustrophobia and suffocation swept over him, and he almost went mad. Slowly his scattered wits returned, and he began to dig away the damp sand on one side, tossing it into the space ahead of him. The air soon became so foul he thought he was strangling, and his head began to throb like a drum, and he seemed to be breathing sand. He redoubled his efforts, but presently the space ahead of him became full up, and there was nowhere else to put the sand that he scooped out. Frantic now, he struggled to draw his knees up to his chin, and finally managed to turn around. He was facing the fallen stone. Clawing like a ratter going after a gopher, he was able to dig away the sand under the stone until it sank lower in the earth and made an opening at the top through which he could breathe fresher air. More digging lowered the obstacle until he was able to creep over it, and completely exhausted in mind and body, he crawled back to his cell. The cave-in gave him a frightful trauma. He could not shake the horror of it from his mind, and for months after, he could not bring himself to go near the tunnel. His dreams were haunted by the experience. Finally, his courage took an upswing, and he resumed work on his tunnel, but he always took along his sharpened file to use on himself should such a disaster happen again, knowing that over the stone which he had fallen there were several other stones all hanging loosely, and under these stones he had to crawl hundreds of times before he finally reached the gallery. His work was completed late in 1763. He had been a prisoner in Magdeburg's Star Fort for over 9 years. All he had to do was break through the gallery floor and hop over the rampart. He didn't do it. Instead, he called for the officer of the guard. What Trenck did at this point is almost inconceivable. Some historians suggest that he had suffered too much for too long, that his mind had cracked, while others maintain that the wily baron knew exactly what he was doing, risking his ace in the hole on a wild gamble. Knowing that a prince of the royal house was at that time visiting Magdeburg, he threw himself on the sovereign's mercy, saying, "Tell the prince that I have dug a tunnel and escape whenever I like, and that I will do so unless the prince promises me his protection." The officer quickly reported to the governor, who rushed to Trenck's cell and demanded proof of his statement. Trenck showed him the completed tunnel. It was a staggering revelation, and the governor promptly had the baron placed in the guard room while the masons walled up the tunnel and paved his cell with flagstones. It was a very bad time for Trenck. It looked as though his gamble had failed and he was about to lose everything. Then at the last moment, a messenger arrived from Berlin with an order for Trenck's release. In 1764, Baron Trenck walked out of prison a free man. Baron Trenck lived to the ripe age of 68, and might have grown even riper had he not made the mistake of visiting Paris in 1791 during the time of the French Revolution. The new French dictator, Maximilien Robespierre, had him arrested as an Austrian spy and thrown into prison. The baron was executed by guillotine in 1794.